I rise to speak on the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment Pandemic Management Bill 2021. And to start this speech, in the words of pandemic law supporter Ms Patton as acting president on 3AW recently, the devil will be in the detail, and indeed it is. I'd like to say at the outset that Derryn's Justice Party agrees that throughout this pandemic we've needed to take unprecedented steps in order to keep people safe from what we know is a dangerous virus. We have to look at the ICUs in our state and across Australia currently to figure that out. However, there are measures that have been taken that go well beyond this goal and encroach on the freedoms that we fought extremely hard for and which have been taken away unnecessarily. Our disappointment that 3 crossbench MPs would try to sell this bill as not another state of emergency is frankly misleading. Mr Medic even stated on Facebook, and I quote, "It is not an extended state of emergency. It removes the requirement for Victoria to be in a state of emergency for a pandemic ever again," unquote. Ms Ratnam said, and I quote, "These new laws means that there will be no more state of emergency for COVID." This bill is absolutely, and I unquote that, this bill is absolutely a legislated state of emergency for pandemics. It allows the government the same powers as conferred by the state of emergency, and for Ms Patton, Mr Medic and Ms Ratnam to state otherwise, to justify the support of this bill, is just simply wrong. It is the same stuff as a state of emergency, just gift wrapped, akin to putting lipstick on a pig. I'll talk more about these 3 crossbenchers later, but I just wanted to touch on some of these statements and also some statements that Mr Medic raised recently on radio in relation to this bill. Some comments made last week on the ABC. Firstly, Mr Medic has agreed that this bill is flawed, saying that it should be improved, even stating he's been asking the government to improve it. In fact, he's asked for an additional oversight mechanisms of the bill. And this would contrast his immediate support of the bill, even stating on Facebook, and I quote, "I'll be supporting the bill when it comes to our House," unquote. The House amendments do not bring in additional oversight apart from finally ensuring the bill complies with human rights, and that making a pandemic is reasonable. Mr Medic also claimed that once a pandemic disease ceases to be a pandemic disease, the pandemic declaration will be revoked. This is false, given that the definition of a pandemic is quite literally that a pandemic declaration can be enacted where only a disease of pandemic potential exists in the world, and I'll point that I'll make later on. However, in my debate of this bill, I'd like to start, as I always do with most bills these days, and talk about the lack of consultation. I said it a few weeks ago and I'll say it now. Our party was never consulted on this bill, nor were we afforded that opportunity. We received a 30-minute briefing by the Health Minister's advisors the week before last, but unlike 3 crossbenchers, we never knew about the ins and outs of the bill until the media reported it. A government minister said in the other place that the government only consulted people who put up their hand and said, yes, we want to work with the government. We want to work through the challenges of this bill. But it wasn't until Ms Crozier was accidentally sent an email about the existence of the planning for this bill back in March, I'm led to believe, or thereabouts, that we found out what was happening. If that mistake hadn't been made, we would have never known about it. We would have welcomed consultation in this bill, but because we didn't support the first 2 state of emergency extensions, we were never afforded that opportunity. And this needs to be put on the public record that once we disagreed with the government's position, we were struck out of negotiations and consultations. In fact, in a Guardian article recently on the 15th of November, Minister Foley stated, and I quote, "We're working through all of these issues with crossbenchers who have chosen to engage constructively," unquote. Well, how on earth could other crossbenchers engage constructively when we weren't even engaged in the very first place? On this note, I'd like to give a shout out to the Age for posting the bill online so I can look at it at the same time as others in the community. Why was I in a position to have read the bill from the media rather than the Parliament or the government? I'm not too sure. This was incredibly disrespectful to those MPs who are tasked with voting on this important bill, and it shows arrogance and disrespect to elected members of Parliament. Like I said the day after hearing about the bill briefing being undertaken by Mr Medic, Ms Patton and Ms Ratnam, apparently we are not part of the cool kids in the school group. To push the bill through shows us that on this occasion the government has not afforded other parties the consideration of adequate parliamentary oversight and scrutiny. And this is what this chamber is for. We've had 3 sitting weeks left when the bill was introduced in the other place, and so there was ample time for debate if they'd chosen to adjourn for the week. A poor decision. Lastly, on this lack of consultation, it isn't only MPs who are annoyed about the lack of consultation on the bill. Notably, the Victorian Bar Association have said the appalling bill, in their words, caught out the government in a lie. The president of the association, Christopher Blandon QC, said he was offended that the bar was referred to as an organisation that was part of the, and I quote, expert reference group, unquote, when they only had a 45-minute online meeting about the bill in June. Although the broad issue of declaration of pandemics was raised in their meeting, the bar said that there was no further contact, so their concerns were never resolved. They further said, and I quote, the Victorian Bar was never provided with a draft bill. 2 members of the Victorian Bar Council were registered to attend a 1-hour consultation workshop in September 2021. This workshop was cancelled at short notice and was never rescheduled, unquote. Apparently, this is consultation. I have to say that the bill is somewhat an improvement on what we have now. These state of emergency powers caught us all by surprise in March last year when we had severe restrictions placed on our lives that we didn't know were even possible. I think we all understood that some things had to change. Large gatherings and events needed to be reduced, density limits to some extent, and mask wearing in high-risk settings. But this has happened all over the world. In places where there were few restrictions, like Brazil, we were seeing mass graves being plotted, which was just absolutely gut-wrenching. But then things got ridiculous. Hotel quarantine was botched. Decisions were made with no health advice whatsoever. Curfews and playgrounds, does that ring any bells? We didn't get the 4,000 beds we were promised about 18 months ago, and that would have assisted us in opening up sooner. So, no wonder the public trust has diminished significantly in the last few years. Speaking of not getting what was promised, why are our schools still waiting to get air purifiers that were told that they will get in order to reduce the risk of contracting the infectious disease? Why the delay on these important tools against COVID, especially within an area where children are at risk and are continuing to get the virus and at times incredibly sick? Why do we have air purifiers here in this place? We've got a few of them. This is a massive open area, and yet we've got air purifiers here. Why do we have them here and not at schools? I just don't understand it. It's disgraceful. It's a slap on the face of schools, teachers and students who we have been and remain so very proud of the work they've done in these incredibly trying and unprecedented times. I'm very tempted to grab a few of these air purifiers in here, put them in the back of my car and deliver them to schools myself. If it wasn't so serious, it'd be an absolute joke. This bill comes at a time when people are sick and tired of governments interfering in their lives. They want some accountability placed on individuals to make their own choices, rather than the government giving them an ultimatum of you get the jab or you lose your job, or you get your jab, you don't step foot into retail, at least at the end of 2022. When will it end? On to the specifics of the bill. Firstly, the definition of pandemic is so loose and so broad. A pandemic can be declared when, somewhere in the world, there is a disease floating around that our health department could deem to have pandemic potential. Whilst the precautionary principle could be applied, we have to consider that by invoking a pandemic declaration, the government have the power to make unfettered pandemic orders on the Victorian community. The oversight here, according to the government, is that the Chief Health Officer needs to provide advice that the disease has pandemic potential or that there is indeed a pandemic. But we need to remember that the CHO is a government-appointed bureaucrat. Given the definition of pandemic is so broad, it also raises the question around the length of time a pandemic can be declared, which the bill says is 3 months at a time. We could literally have a pandemic declaration that allows restrictions on our lives as long as COVID exists somewhere in the world. It doesn't matter if 99% of us are vaccinated and there are 0 deaths. Just having this option available to any government is extremely worrying. Secondly, to the health advice that is frequently cited in the legislation, I think it's great that the government have finally succumbed to the realisation that the Victorian people need reasons for being locked in their homes and being able to do things like play at the park, travel more than 5 k's from home and wearing a mask out when playing golf or fishing. We need reasons. I couldn't have summed it up better than Shannon Deary's recent post in the Herald Sun titled, and I quote, "What don't they want us to know?" unquote. Basically, he questioned the authenticity of any health advice we're going to see under this legislation if, at the same time, the health department are fighting tooth and nail not to release advice that they have used to base the February lockdown on. They're fighting so hard not to have to release the advice citing the reasons that it would jeopardise the trust between public officials and ministers. Further, it would reveal, and I quote, high-level deliberative processes of government, unquote. Deary said, and I quote, "Something smells. If the government is so committed to releasing future advice to the point it is making it illegal not to do so, then why not start now? unquote. I absolutely agree. He further states, and I quote, "How are we to trust that the future advice under this bill will be the whole of the advice relied upon?" Unquote. And this is exactly my point. I welcome the parts of the bill that will finally force the government to tell us the reasons behind all of its pandemic powers, but I don't hold my breath that this advice will be authentic or the whole truth. Why am I perhaps cynical? Well, the government is not only not releasing health advice relied upon in February, but it has also not released advice and human charter assessments to this place as resolved by the Chamber on a number of occasions. Everyone has asked for the advice for 2 years now, and we've received donuts. Lastly, we also have concerns about detention, which Ms Maxwell will talk about later. My greatest concern with this part of the bill is that where you are falsely detained, there is no ramification, penalty or punishment for the bureaucrat who put you there. Talk about a lack of accountability. There is also no definition of detention, except for the fact that it isn't necessarily isolation or quarantining, as outlined in section 165BE. So what is detention? As you can see, there are a plethora of issues with the bill. Before I conclude, I want to remind all of those who are watching that Mr Medic, Ms Patton and Dr Ratnam have, according to these crossbenchers themselves, been working to improve the bill with the government since its introduction. Ms Patton has agreed to support amendments, and Mr Medic has admitted on radio that there are flaws in the bill in relation to detention, the 3-month unlimited extensions and so on. This is despite their support for the bill when it first came out. This morning, the three have come out saying they'll support the bill with all the new changes that have been able to secure. Well, in our opinion, the government's House amendments don't go far enough. They were the absolute minimum and all but completely ignore suggestions by our prominent legal bodies, including the Victorian Bar Association and the Law Institute of Victoria. It is clear the community are paying very close attention to the voting for this bill, as we all are, given that this will almost certainly be enacted mid-December this year for who knows how long. After all, this is probably one of the most important bills MPs have voted on in the last number of decades. On this, to say we have been inundated with emails of the past weeks would be an understatement. And no, they're not campaign emails with the same words and narrative. They are mainly, individually scribed community members with legitimate concerns. I was going to print them all out, but I thought, what a waste of paper, so I didn't. We have been elected by the people to represent members of our constituency. The people have well and truly spoken. It is imperative that we give our constituents a voice, rather than prioritising our own political agenda. To those who have contacted my office, in particular those from the Western Victorian electorate, I'll thank you for sharing your concerns about this bill with my office. Lastly, I want to put on record how disappointed I am that we have been presented with such a flawed bill to the extent that we have over 90 amendments. And those are just the ones that I know about writing this. This bill will take us a few days of our precious time in Parliament to debate. What this means is that we lose time to debate things around victims of crime, our legal system, which is in a shambles, mental health and so much more. Rest assured, we will continue to fight for these areas. So to conclude, Darren Hedges Justice Party has made our position very clear that we do not and will not support this bill.